I think that's the modern-day equivalent of a drum roll. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Price. I'm a board member of the Atlantic Council, and it is my privilege to welcome you to today's event discussing 25 years of transition in post-communist Europe. I'd like to thank our IMF guests, who are the main authors of the report, Asim Hussain, James Rofe, and Bikas Joshi. Unfortunately, Mr. Joshi could not join us this morning. But our authors will be joined on the podium by Mark Sobel, and we're delighted he's here with us. This is the debut of the report in the United States, and it comes at a crucial time when developments in Eastern Europe, including conflicts with Russia, threaten to impede economic growth in the European Union and therefore globally. Now, I feel a special connection to this region for several reasons. One, my grandparents on both sides are from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Two, in 1974, it was my pleasure to act as a tour guide through Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, actually in 74, 75, and 76, for American high school students. Little did I know that some 20 years later, I would be working at the US Trade Representative's office, negotiating trade and investment agreements with these countries, normalizing trade relations, in the case of trade under the so-called Jackson-Vanik trade agreements, and negotiating bilateral investment treaties with them. That experience confirmed to me the enormity of the change undergone in that region, and it is a remarkable, if incomplete, transformation. But 25 years after the fall of communism, and just a few years after the 2008 financial crisis, former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe are again at a crucial inflection point. The conflict in Eastern Ukraine, the legacy of corruption in Kiev, and a return, unfortunately, to more authoritarian government in some of these former communist countries now threatens to hinder or reverse political and economic progress. Moreover, and again more broadly speaking, growth in the Eurozone is stagnating, and Germany's near-term economic prospects are somewhat uncertain. So today it is of utmost importance that the transatlantic community work together to address these political and economic challenges and foster growth across Europe and the rest of the global economy. This event here at the Council will launch the so-called EuroGrowth Conversation Series. It is a new component of the Global Business and Economic Program here at the Council under the leadership of its new director, Andrea Montagnino. The Atlantic Council will convene a series of distinguished economists, private sector leaders, and government officials from the United States and Europe to discuss ways to foster growth in European economies. The IMF report we are here today to discuss focuses on the dramatic transformation of Europe's former communist countries, and I commend this excellent report to you. As David Lipton, the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, points out in his foreword, this is a success story. Not complete, but it is indeed a success story, attributable, in his words, to great and courageous people, to smart strategies, and to the magnetic pull of the European Union, and finally, to external support from international organizations that have worked. It is now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Asim Hussain from the IMF, a principal author, who will kick off the discussion with a summary of their report. Thank you very much.
So Dan, thank you very much for that intro. Thank you also especially to Andrea Montanino for inviting us here to present this report. Thank you also, of course, to the Atlantic Council. It's a matter of some pride to me personally, and I think to the IMF more generally, to be the launch of your new EuroGrowth series. So that we look forward to participating and maybe even presenting in future sessions of that. So 25 years ago, as Dan told us, a very massive transition began, a transformation really of Europe, of Eastern Europe in 1989. And what was amazing about this transformation was it was quite abrupt. As little as a year ago, maybe even months before it actually got started, I don't think very many of us could have imagined where things could go could it be anywhere near where they are today. Now, the report that we prepared to mark this 25th anniversary of the transition, we released just a few weeks ago, and it's necessarily a very broad brush account of 25 years in 20 or so countries, and to cover everything in any sort of nearly comprehensive way, of course, would be completely impossible. But to do even the slightest bit of justice, we had to focus purely on the sort of the macro perspective, which is, after all, what the IMF does do. So what you will see in the report is a very sort of macro account. But that is not to say that the micro account was not important. In fact, one could argue that the micro account was at least as, and perhaps even more important, the creation of new legal frameworks, of economic institutions, of new incentives for firms and households to operate in market economies. That was fundamentally something that the region had not seen in essentially since the beginning of the century, or certainly since the World War. Now, from our side, apart from covering a unique and really transformative topic, the study itself is a bit of an innovation. So it was conceived and done essentially by our representatives in the field, as we call them. So our resident representatives in Eastern Europe led the work. James Rove, who will present most of this paper when I hand over the podium to him, led the project, along with Vikas Joshi, who was supposed to be here to present today, but some change of plans sort of at the 11th hour forced him to not be in Washington this week. We also have here a few additional authors who participate in this project from Washington. Michael Gorbanyov, Joanna Svirch, and Ricardo Yodes are here, so they'll be happy to take questions, I think, afterward if anyone wants to sort of pick their brains. One interesting story that I only realized this morning, I was introducing the authors to various people here and realized that James and Michael had never actually met, and so they met each other for the first time today. So it's been a unique sort of piece of work from our side, having people from in different parts of the world working together to produce what we think is a report that you will find of interest. Now, let me highlight the transformation and the challenges ahead in the first few minutes of this before turning over to James. And let me start with just a little bit of a sketch of what I propose to do, or what James and I propose to do in the few minutes to start off this session. So first, I'm going to present a very brief and general overview of the transformation, just to highlight and underscore the extent of the political and economic change that Europe has seen, Eastern Europe has seen in the last quarter century. Then I'm going to follow, or the both of us will follow a roughly chronological account of the transformation with a few digressions here and there. I will do the first part of the talk and talk about the early stabilization efforts that were made, basically to stabilize the economies and to stop output from shrinking, to control inflation, and to bring the public finances back to order. And then James will turn to the reform process and basically give you a much more sort of thorough account of the structural transformation that has taken place, including reforms that were prompted by joining of many countries or acceding to the European Union. And then James will talk about integration, which of the Eastern Europe into the global trade and financial network, looking, of course, at the benefits of that integration, but also thinking a little bit about what costs might have accompanied that transformation. Some of these costs, of course, only became evident with the global financial crisis. And then finally, James is going to end with a look back and a look forward. So looking back in one broad brush at the 25 years, and then maybe thinking a little bit about what the next 25 might bear. Okay, so this is a continent transformed, and let me talk a little bit about what Europe looked like in 1989, which now seems a century ago. This is a political map of 1989, and we've got in blue the European Union or the precursors of the European Union, and in red the Comecon economies, led of course by the Soviet Union, but also many of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And then we've got another group of countries, mainly former Yugoslavia, but also Albania, that were socialist economies that did not have sort of a market-based system. And now let me fast forward to today. 11 of the former socialist economies have become already members of the European Union. And of those, 4, soon to be 5, have adopted the euro as their currency, so they're members of the eurozone. 6 more of these economies are actually recognized candidates of the European Union, are in various stages of negotiations to join the European Union. And what the map, notwithstanding recent geopolitical tensions, shows is basically a continent that is much more integrated and one. Now, many of the countries had been members of the IMF already, even before the transition began. Yugoslavia, for example, was one of the original signatories, but there was a huge jump in 1989 and the years immediately after when 25 new members from the ex-socialist bloc joined the IMF by the end of 1993, in fact. And then more have followed in more recent years as some of the new former Yugoslav republics have become members as well. Now let me sort of turn to growth and convergence over the 25 years. And this, I hope to dazzle you with some fancy graphics here. So the upper part of this graph has a picture of growth. And what you see in the early part of the transition is really the very sharp drop in growth or economic output in basically across the region in all groups. Now, what we're going to stick to in terms of colors, and James is almost religious about this, so I have to tell you that the color scheme here is important. Blue is the Baltics, and we're going to stick with that throughout the presentation. Green is Central Europe. Southeastern Europe, the European Union members of Southeastern Europe are colored red. The Western Balkan countries are colored orange, and the CIS countries are purple. So what you see is all groups saw a very sharp output decline in the early years of transition. In some cases, as much as 30 to 40% of GDP was lost during those early years or more. Now, one can argue about the numbers here, whether output was adequately or properly captured in sort of the pre-transition net material product statistics and so forth. But whether it was 30 or 40% or a little less or a little more, I think one thing is very clear, that across the region, output contracted sharply. Really, it was a period of major disruption. Now, what you have in the lower part is what happened to income levels relative to the European Union. And what you see is, in most cases, a backward movement. Output shrank, or income levels, per capita income levels relative to the European Union shrank initially. By 1995, most of the region was seeing positive growth, and as you see in the upper portion of the chart, and some movement started to happen, as you see in the lower part of the chart, toward Western European standards of living. But for most countries, even by sort of the late 1990s, initial output levels per capita had not yet been regained. Finally, in the third part of the period, which is roughly 2000 to 2007, so until just before the global crisis, was a period of sort of booming economic growth, 6% on average per year across the region, huge capital inflows intermediated mainly by bank flows, but also a lot of foreign direct investment. Rapid convergence toward Western European levels, which you see in the bottom part of the chart. Also, though, what happened during this period was the emergence of large macroeconomic imbalances. Some countries were running current accounts deficits of the order of 25% of GDP. Lending was growing very, very rapidly, financed, in many cases, in foreign currency, financed by borrowing, and as a result, there were major consumption and, in some cases, construction booms. Now, a lot of that came to a wrenching bust with the global financial crisis. Among emerging market regions worldwide, Eastern Europe was in fact the largest hit and saw the largest contractions in output during that time. Especially those countries that saw the largest inflows saw perhaps the largest contractions. Now, what you see in the lower part of the chart, though, convergence vis-a-vis Western Europe didn't sort of reverse too much because, of course, Western Europe saw large sort of contraction in activity as well. And then finally, in the post-crisis period, there is recovery now across the region, but it's a weak recovery, or a tepid recovery, I should say, and it's held back by many factors. Weak Eurozone is perhaps the single most important factor because the Eurozone is, after all, has become the largest trading partner for the region. Also, banks are reluctant to lend, have become much more risk-averse, and in many cases still the balance sheets of banks are being rebuilt. There is significant fiscal retrenchment going on in the region, so all of this is translating into a slow or a tepid recovery and slow income convergence with Western Europe. Let me move very quickly on to the early years, the stabilization part of the story. So in the early years, the immediate challenge was stabilization. There was a huge monetary overhang in most countries, unrealistic prices under communism, and monetary financing of fiscal deficits in the early years meant that a burst of inflation was inevitable. And as the chart shows, even though there's a pretty wide range, almost every country had very high inflation, and in many countries, inflation was at hyper-inflationary levels. It was a massive challenge that the countries faced, and it was compounded by the lack of a functioning monetary institutions. Central banks needed to be established, and most countries had what were called monobanks. So the monobanks had to be divided into commercial banks, which conducted business activities, and a central bank with policy responsibilities. Now, the degree of central bank independence that was achieved by countries, it turns out, had a very important bearing on how quickly stabilization was achieved. Those with strong central banks established quickly, and central banks with a degree of independence were more successful in achieving stabilization early on. Now, the countries of the former Soviet Union had an additional challenge, which was whether to create their own currencies or to try and maintain the ruble zone. And political and technical factors made staying in the ruble zone untenable over time. But establishing new currencies was no easy task either. And the choice of a nominal anchor was also essential, faced not just by countries exiting the ruble zone, but really by all countries, whether to target the exchange rate or whether to target the monetary base was one of the challenges they all faced. So the general lesson that emerged in those early years, countries, as I said, that were able to secure central bank independence and monetary policy credibility early on, get their fiscal and quasi-fiscal deficits under control early on, they were the ones that achieved macroeconomic stabilization relatively early. As the chart shows, eventually inflation was brought under control, but for some countries it took a very long time and multiple attempts. Now, this chart shows the various exchange rate regimes that prevailed in the countries. I'm going to go through this quickly. What you see in the various different colors are the types of exchange rate regimes. The green is fully floating. The yellow-orange is sort of an intermediate regime. Red is a fixed exchange rate or a peg, and blue is entry into the Eurozone. So in the early years, you saw really the bulk of the countries had some sort of an intermediate regime. And as we entered into the global crisis over time, countries went to the polar ends. Many became much more flexible in their exchange rates, so transformed into the green area, and others became much more fixed. In other words, either adopted the euro or very credible or strong pegs. But whether it was a fixed or a floating regime that countries chose to adopt, there was a tendency for real exchange rates to appreciate throughout the region, again with a very wide variation, but a general trend of a real appreciation. Until, that is, the global financial crisis, since which time basically real exchange rates have been flat. Now, this masks major variation. It also masks differences in experience across fixed and floating regimes. Generally speaking, one interesting thing that I find in this chart is that countries with floating regimes tended to appreciate in real terms a little more or significantly more in the years before the crisis, and have tended to depreciate somewhat more in the years since the global financial crisis. So that, I think, underscores the cushioning impact that a flexible exchange rate regime can play. Now, where was the IMF throughout the early years of transition, during especially the stabilization period? A number of the new governments did, in fact, seek IMF assistance, both in financing external and budgetary deficits, but also in helping establish macroeconomic frameworks. Poland in 1990 was the first program that the IMF had with countries in the region, and it was put in place just months after the fall of the Berlin Wall. A new structural transformation facility, STF we called it then, was set up to support countries as they built up capacity and policy credibility before they could really move to a full-fledged IMF-supported financial program. The STF, of course, did carry financial support as well. But programs were not the only thing we did. Technical assistance and training played a very large role in those early years as well. In fact, the early stabilization efforts in Eastern Europe are perhaps the best example of the IMF really being a serious player and an important contributor in upgrading the technical skills needed to function as market economies. So the left part of this chart shows IMF technical assistance, which really grew by leaps and bounds in the early years. And the right side of the chart shows training. The joint Vienna Institute, which is very much in operation even today, was set up then. And over time, it has actually trained 12,000 individuals from the region. With that, let me turn over to James.
Okay, thanks very much, Asim. I'm not going to break up the flow with any introductions other than just to repeat what Asim said about how grateful we are to be here. And I'm grateful for everybody who's turned up on a Monday morning in December to hear us. Now, let me move straight on with reforms. So the reforms, one of the key messages I think in this report is about the relationship between reforms and growth, how important it was for reforms to happen. And we find this as the key element which determined the success or otherwise of countries in the transition. Some countries, some other factors, of course, initial conditions, location mattered. Initial conditions, of course, mattered a lot for reforms because some countries were much readier to adopt reforms than others. But over the full 25 years, I think we'll be showing a number of charts that relate this point of reforms to growth, and that is, of course, a key message going forward as well. At the start, there was a long discussion also about whether countries should do shock therapy or gradualism. That's been a continuing discussion. I think our view, is pretty much in line with most of the consensus now that really getting on with broad-based reforms across the whole spectrum of needs was the only way to really get growth going again, to get new industries into place, which has been the key to growth, rather than trying to maintain old industries to allow an environment for new industries to grow. So the EBRD has a very nice set of indicators, which I show here, which track reforms across various different sectors over the full transition period. And you can see this overall shape of reforms being rapid in the early years, and then tending to slow down, even in countries and regions where they're far from complete. So you can see some countries, the Baltics and Central Europe did, get very high levels quite quickly. Other countries have been much slower, and the laggards have been the CIS countries and particularly the Western Balkans, these orange countries here. But you can see also how they've slowed down. In Central Europe, you see some even reversals towards the end in some of these indicators, which is a sign, I think, of reform fatigue. I think this is something Dan was getting at the beginning, that some countries are questioning the value of market-based reforms, and I think that's completely the wrong conclusions for countries to draw. In fact, but as growth has been slow, people are wondering if it's if this is the right way to go, and I think this is as I say, this is the wrong inference to draw. If we look at how these are broken up, because you can look with the EBRD indicators either across countries and regions like that, or you can look by type of reform. And there's quite an interesting difference between the types of reforms that countries took. Between what we might call the liberalization reforms, it's very easy to write by decree price liberalization, trade liberalization, and that most countries did, and pretty much all countries except Belarus are pretty much complete in liberalization. Small-scale privatization, similarly, quite it was something that's much easier for countries to do. These much more difficult and in some ways most important reforms, certainly most important from where we are now, are these more structural micro reforms of competition policy, enterprise governance, and also large-scale privatization, where vested interests are involved. Vested interests have often opposed these, and you can see many countries are far behind on these kind of nitty-gritty reforms that can run into a lot of political pressure, and these are the countries which are also facing, I think, some of the biggest problems from a growth and convergence point of view. Privatization, I just mentioned here. I mean, many countries in Central Eastern Europe probably on large-scale privatization. The Central Europe, the Baltics, that's mostly complete. A lot of other countries are still a long way from doing it. But the privatization altogether, if we just go back to the 1990s, I think it's worth remembering, what a massive task privatization was. We have a box in the report about this that you can look at more detail. But privatization in 1989 was a term that had become used for these single, large, discrete enterprises being privatized in the UK and some other countries in a very stable legal environment. Single enterprises privatized. In these countries, in the transition countries, you had something completely different. I mean, it really shouldn't have been the same term, I think, because what you had is countries going from 10% of GDP or 15% of GDP private sectors needing to get to 70 or 80% within a matter of 5-10 years is what countries generally did. So it was an absolutely huge undertaking. It was very, very messy process. I think necessarily, I'm not sure there could really have been a much, some countries did it better than others, but I don't think there was ever going to be an easy way to do it given the legal environment they were in. Okay, so let me try and link now privatization, these reform indicators on the right to convergence on the vertical here. And you can see in these countries, you can see this general trend going up there, this link between reform leading to convergence. And you don't see, if we include all the countries in this, you don't see countries to the right, to the bottom right, which reform and don't get any convergence. That doesn't happen. You do see some countries more into the left, which is the CIS bubble there, where you've had quite a lot of convergence despite not very much reform. That's really driven by Russia and Belarus, which are two countries which I think are influenced particularly by oil. And so that's part of the reason I think why some countries have been able to escape this. But in general, if you don't have oil, you don't get convergence without growth. And we tried to look at this in a little bit more detail, a little bit more rigorously by looking at a regression of this. Here is on the right-hand side this EBRD indicator. Vertically, this is growth over 2000 to 2013. So this is the sort of second half of the period. And you can see that at the beginning it looks like there's not much relationship there. But of course, in economics, as we say, you torture the data until they confess. And it didn't take much. This data gave up pretty easily, I would say, because as soon as you put initial income levels in, of course, we expect a convergence that the poorer countries are going to grow faster. As soon as you put that in, they start tidying up pretty nicely. And then with just a couple of further controls, this sort of barrow regression type controls, where you control for government expenditure and education levels, they really got into a very powerful, strong relationship there. Except, again, Belarus, again, is a complete outlier. We could have a whole seminar on Belarus, so I'm not going to discuss it now, but it is a unique case, I think. But and if we look at the results of the regression, what we get is that if you reform by an extra 1 point on the EBRD indicators, you get about 1.5% of growth permanently going forward. So it's a strong and powerful relationship. So we see that. Okay, let me move on now to integration. So here we're telling a story more about the kind of 2000s period, I would say. First of all, trade integration. Here we're seeing trade as percent of GDP, exports as a percent of GDP across these countries. And you can see there's a large variation. You've got this Central European supply chain. You've got the Baltics, very high shares of exports to GDP. Look at former Yugoslavia, the Western Balkans, very, very low shares of GDP down there. And I think that's related to the problems that some of these countries have, low growth, low export orientation among the countries. If we add on to this the directions of exports, these are all the flows worth more than 5% of source country GDP. And you can see Western Europe, of course, is the main magnet for flows. Within that, Germany is by far the dominant recipient of trade flows. Russia, the former Soviet Union countries, the Baltics still have a lot of trade with Russia. But look in the middle at the orange, I think they are red arrows, how little trade there is within the region. Intra-regional trade is very low. Only, again, the Baltics and this Central European supply chain, German supply chain economies have significant amount of trade between them. Former Yugoslavia all used to be one country 25 years ago. Now barely any trade between each other. So I think again this is an opportunity, if you like, to that countries could have to aid growth through more integration internally. We had a series. If we move now to financial integration, in the 1990s, huge amount of banking crises. The banks inherited bad loans from the former system. Where there'd been no real credit, banks hadn't had any kind of credit control or credit monitoring. They'd simply just lent money where it was needed under central planning. These loans all went bad through the 90s. There was pressure to continue supporting these industries that were failing, and it ended up with banking crises everywhere. I think every country basically had a banking crisis in the 90s. What was the reaction to this? This politically allowed governments to welcome foreign banks into the banking system. As local banks failed, foreign banks came in, and you can see that most of the region was dominated. Foreign banks dominated the region by by the mid 2000s. Foreign banks brought they brought know-how. They very importantly brought an arm's length relationship with clients. So the previous problems of connected lending were mostly solved by foreign banks coming in, and of course they brought financing, but they also contributed. The flip side of this financial integration was contribution by the foreign banks to the very rapid boom that happened. And increasingly through the 2000s, the strong growth led by imports, inflows of capital, became more and more imbalanced. Banks were falling over themselves to lend. People were borrowing. It was all going into consumption, all going into construction, this kind of thing, and not into productive uses. So we saw this boom, and now if we look at what happened, at the top we have credit growth, extraordinary levels, 30% of GDP, 30% real credit growth per year across the region, associated with this imbalance, bigger and bigger current account deficits at the bottom. If we look at it by a country, the same thing. By countries, you can see this relationship again holding some enormous credit bubbles going on and very large current account deficits. I think Bulgaria reached 25% of GDP in deficit in 2007, for example. And very difficult, even policymakers, I think people weren't fully cognizant of how big a problem it was. There was a lot of warnings about it, but probably not enough understanding of how dangerous this was. But even when countries did try to stop it, it was very hard to do so. Countries are in the EU, the flows are coming in, you can't have capital controls. You try and tighten up regulation in the banking system, and banks will find a way around it through leasing or through direct loans from headquarters and so on. So it was very difficult to do anything about. And of course, it did end up in tears, as we saw with the collapse of GDP that Asim was talking about. So let's just look what happened from the IMF's perspective in the crisis. Here's the chart that Asim showed you before. This is the output drops are on the vertical again. Programs through the 1990s. In the 2000s, this boom period when really the market was providing all the financing to the country. Everybody was growing strongly. Everybody believed in this convergence story that the fund would never be needed again in this region or perhaps anywhere else. And very few programs there, you can see in the early 2000s. And then, bang, the crisis hit, and we had these very large programs. You can see the size of the bubble is the amount of lending that we were doing. Huge programs, very large output collapses. I think if the programs hadn't been this big, the output collapses would have been even larger. But these were now capital account crises, so we had to provide lots of money to provide confidence, to shore up reserves, to prevent, as I say, larger adjustment needs in these huge current account deficits that are built up. And really through Eastern Europe, that was the main focus of fund lending in the crisis. We also, you can see here the yellow bits there are new facilities we brought in at the time, which were used by Poland, and also Macedonia had a version of it, of a precautionary lending line to give confidence in countries' policies. So that's been the experience we've had since. Most of those programs are now finished. We have now a number of programs in the region. Of course, you know about Ukraine, Albania, Serbia shortly, Bosnia, Romania, where we're it's more of the longer-term issues rather than this big crisis management that we're doing there now. Okay, let me get on to the final section. Here, looking at the legacies and challenges that countries are facing now, and I think perhaps this chart here summarizes the overall story. We were having a very strong growth convergence through the 2000s. People believed, in a generation, all of these countries were kind of on autopilot to converge to Western European living standards in a generation or so. And that has completely stalled since the crisis. We've really seen very little further convergence since the crisis, led to a lot of disillusionment and kind of questions now, I think, about the model in the region. And that's pretty much the case. Wherever you look, it's slowed down. Again, with our sort of standard regional breakdown here, you can see the convergence has stalled everywhere. So what needs to be done to get convergence back on track? Again, our answer is not turning back the clock and going back to more government intervention, which a few countries I think are thinking about. Our answer is more reform to catch up the unfinished agenda of reform. in countries, where it hasn't been completed, and a few key areas I'll go through. First, the financial sector. There's been a big legacy of this boom and bust cycle in the financial sector of bad loans. That's been associated with deleveraging by banks, where banks are reluctant to lend to what is now seen as much less profitable opportunities. You have at the same time the pressure from Western Europe to build up capital, which has tended to cause banks to want to withdraw capital from this region. And you can see here in this bad loan chart that it's really Southeast Europe that's the biggest problem. So it's very important to clean up balance sheets, to put banks back into a sustainable, financial position to be ready to continue lending and to look for credit opportunities rather than sort of trying to nurture a bad portfolio. Business climate, I think this is the absolute key area, and one of the probably, perhaps the most critical difference between countries is what we look at in the business climate across the region. You have the Baltics, so these are three kind of standard measures of governance type, corruption, business climate, doing business measures. To the right are the highest ranking countries in these global ranking surveys. To the left are the lowest ranking countries. So maybe 150 countries in each of these or something, 150 countries. You can see the blue ones, again, the Baltics generally doing pretty well. Central Europe mostly doing well, although, clearly there's a number of countries in Central Europe that could do a lot better. It's not great to be around the 50 percentile. There's every opportunity that these countries have to do better. But as you move into Southeast Europe and the Western Balkans, the CIS, you can see the huge range there is there now. And this is absolutely critical for whether countries are going to grow, as to whether they have a climate in which people want to invest, a climate in which businesses are free to grow, whether bankrupt countries can actually be bankrupted and exit the market, release the resources to allow new companies to make use of them. So I think this is a critical area where all countries need to work harder. We haven't talked at all about fiscal. This is a very short presentation covering a huge amount of ground. So I'm just throwing this up so you can see there's more about it in the report. But there are, and this is debt on the right and deficit on the left. So you can see the kind of Maastricht zone there at the top left, where a number of countries in the region, I think, have their fiscal situation pretty much in shape now. Equally, a number of countries have major problems in the fiscal area. Again, mostly Southeast Europe down there to the bottom right, where there's a lot of work to do. We now have, I think a positive sign, we now have programs to help these countries in a number of these countries, which I hope will help move them back up and to the left over time. Related to fiscal is demographics. As these countries face a major fall in working age populations. The fact that other countries in the world are also facing this same kind of demographic challenges, I don't think makes it any easier for these countries. It's a challenge to the fiscal, it's a challenge to growth going forward, and it points to the need for more incentives to labour market participation. I think Central Eastern Europe is even in a more difficult situation than most of the countries, the other regions marked here, because overall populations are falling as well. There's still a lot of outmigration, still very low growth rates, natural population changes. So we have a sort of double whammy in Central Eastern Europe from the demographic point of view. Labour markets, again, we haven't talked about much. Extremely important issue across the region. But this chart, I think, shows you how important an issue it is for Southeast Europe, the Balkan countries in particular. This is unemployment along the bottom, employment upwards. So you want to be up at the top left, so you do not want to be at the bottom right, and that's exactly where the Western Balkans are and have been throughout the transition. Very, very problematic labour market institutions. I think some of this is a legacy of the original labour management system they had. But there's an awful lot of work to be done on labour markets there. We have there's a chapter in the report on this, so I'm not going to go into details now, but just to highlight that point. Okay, so this has been a bit negative, what I've been talking about, the challenges. I think if you look at these countries where they are now and see all these challenges, you can see problems everywhere. But I want to come back right at the end now to highlight again, this is a success story. It has been an incredible transformation of these countries in 25 years, where they've gone from to where they are now. And one way we look at this to kind of illustrate this is a cluster analysis, where this cluster analysis takes the countries of Europe and tries to sort them according to kind of measures of simple measures of advancement, like per capita income is the easiest one, but things like agriculture as a share of GDP, energy use per GDP, these kind of indicators, corruption, and you can see that back in 2000, they split across the old east-west boundary pretty much. You've got the yellow and the red are on one side, and the blue and the green are on the other side. If you look, the key thing is this tree diagram that shows how these clusters relate, and you can see that there's a clear split. You've got the yellow and red together, and the blue and green together. Okay, now watch if we move forward to the latest data. You see, almost nothing changed on the right. In fact, there's only one country changed color. Russia turned red. So the actual groupings of countries have essentially stayed the same. Countries still align themselves in the same groups. But what has changed is the relationships between the groups. If you look at this dendrogram, this tree diagram on the left-hand side, you see now that the advanced countries, the more successful countries, are now closer to Western Europe than they are to sort of former communist peers. In fact, within Western Europe, they're closest to the green, but altogether they're aligned with Western Europe. So this is, in one way you could say the transition is, or these are no longer transition countries, or no longer defined purely as transition countries. The transition is complete, if you like, in these countries. I mean, what it means is they've become Western European countries, more like Western European countries. They still have problems, as of course many Western European countries have. This is not a reason that they don't need structural reform. We're always talking about the need for structural reforms in France and Italy and Spain and so on. And of course, it's the same thing with the yellow countries, if you like. But it also highlights, I think, that some countries have been very much left behind, and that there's still very significant problems in a number of if you like, the red countries here in the Balkans and the CIS. Again, on a trying to make a positive note here. If we just run forward, these are the latest IMF projections for where these convergence lines are going to go. And on current projections, it doesn't look great. You can see we're expecting continued, rather subdued growth in the region, as indeed we are in the euro area, which has a lot of influence here. But if we take those regression results we looked at before and say, okay, so supposing countries were to adopt reforms and to move up the EBRD indicator by doing more reforms, where would that lead in terms of convergence? This is if they did, half a point a year, and you get, quite significant pickup there in those numbers. And of course, you get the biggest pickup at the bottom, where the countries need the most, have the most scope to reform, where they're least advanced in reform. So I think this again supports the message that there is a lot to be, this is a story of success, but there's a possibility of more success down the road. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to James and Azim. I'm Andrea Montanino. I'm the director of the Global Business Economics Program. I will moderate the panel discussion, so the second part of this first part of the morning. Let me ask to our panelists to come, and let me introduce our four distinguished speakers this morning. We have Azim Hussain, that we already introduced him. He's a friend and the deputy director of the European Department at the IMF, where his responsibility includes supervision of the IMF's regional work on Central and Eastern Europe, but not just that, because he also supervised Italy. We have Ambassador Andris Razens. Sorry for not pronouncing well your names.
Almost correct, thank you.
Thank you very much. He's ambassador of Latvia to the United States, and he has, of course, a distinguished career in foreign service, and he has been ambassador for his country in Denmark, Morocco, and Mexico, if I'm not wrong, also. Then on my left, again, Ambassador Risner Schnempf. Thank you very much. Ambassador of Poland to the United States. He also had a long career in foreign service for Poland. He has been ambassador in Spain before. He has been also Undersecretary of State at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a couple of years, and ambassador for Poland in Uruguay and Paraguay. And on my far left, Mr. Mark Sobel is Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Monetary and Financial Policy at the U.S. Treasury. He has a lot of responsibilities in the Treasury, participating and coordinating G7, G20 meetings, leading technical level discussion between U.S. and European Commission in the context of the financial market and regulatory dialogue, and also it leads the department's works for the Financial Stability Board. So we have, I mean, among us, 4 persons that can also, that can really help in looking not just back, as we did with the report, but also to look forward on what we expect for the coming years in this region. Before I start with my question, of course, you all are invited to raise your hands, make question, the toughest possible. Probably I cannot do that, but you can. So just show me that you want the floor, and I'll give you the floor. Let me also thanks all of you for being here on behalf of Fred Kemp, our CEO and president. He's actually in the other room because on Monday morning we have our directors meeting, so he couldn't be here, but he said that he would like to. So let me start with my first question to Ambassador Knempf. Poland is clearly one of the most successful country in the area. I'm quite interested to understand which are, say, the internal strength you see in your country. Why, I mean, the country was able to transform so well and being now, I mean, clearly a leading economy in the area. So if you can look a little bit backward and tell us how you saw the transformation in the country, and also, I mean, if you have to explain to a businessman in this country which are the strengths in your economy, in your country, and the reason to go to Poland and invest, for instance.
Well,
so back for the back
yes,
look.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for your very positive opinion. It's very good to be seen as a leader or one of the leaders, but it is also kind of a challenge to maintain this position, which is not that easy. The story of Polish transformation is a success story, as everybody probably knows. And the easiest answer to your question would be that it happened because, first of all, the Polish people are the ambitious people. They always look up, never down. So the perspective to follow the path of the developed European countries was always a vision of not only the leading politicians, but also, I would say, the great majority of the society. Polish people were traveling relatively easy comparing with other countries since 70s. And they have never been trying to compare their situation in economic sense, but first of all in the political liberties with those countries surrounding, but rather looking what's going on in London, in Paris, or in Bonn in that sense. And first of all in the United States, simply because Poland since 19th century had a large Polish-American community here, and the contacts, also intellectual contacts, were very strong and very alive. Now, comparing with other countries of the region, we have one strong point, which is our domestic market, which played an important role in the development of the Polish economy. As we could all see, Poland used this tool, which is rich and ambitious consumption market, which is almost 40 million people, to intervene in the difficult moments like it was in 2008, 2009, where the internal market became a moment of a place where the strength of the Polish economy was focused. We had, and we still have, well-prepared young generations, which is the labor force is not only relatively cheap comparing with other countries, but also it's technologically advanced. And this is why many American companies here or located in Poland can enjoy the Polish engineers and technicians working for the most advanced companies in the world's technology. I could name many of them, but it is not just an incident that the American aviation companies, they located a big part of their production in south of Poland. It's clear that they found there not only the good business environment, but also the working force, which was well prepared to confront this challenge. Then historically, as you ask me, Poland has been preparing its change much longer than probably other countries. This is due to the long tradition of the Polish political opposition, which was active since 50s. So if you look into our history, post-war history, you will find easily that we always had intellectual groups, a kind of a shadow governments that were thinking and working on how to change the country under the communists. So in the moment of the beginning, when the advisors, first advisors from the United States came, and I can name them, Geoffrey Sachs and David Lipton, the stories are very famous. They found a friendly environment to make the change, although few people believed at that moment, I'm talking about 98, that this would be I would say, received with the society positively. Many of the political leaders at that time thought it is absolutely impossible to make such drastic changes in Polish economy and put them out of the leash. I remember David Lipton telling me the story when he arrived to Warsaw in '89, and he met Bronisław Geremek and Jacek Kuroń, and together with Geoffrey Sachs, they explained what is really the reform, the transformation means. They got scared. I mean, the Polish said, impossible, it won't work. Nobody will accept it. Geoffrey Sachs said, there's no other way around. You have to do that. I just said, impossible. We will have strikes. We will have all people against us. So they came to the idea, well, we have to go to Gdańsk, and if you convince Lech Wałęsa, it may work. So that's what they did. They convinced him, and the fact that Poland had a strong and leader with at that time, very, I wouldn't say 100%, but very deep confidence, meant a lot to embark on a program which for many people was a dramatic change of their life.
I see. Thank you very much. And Mark, I have a question for you. I mean, in the presentation, Azim and James didn't cover too much Russia, but clearly Russia is a relevant country in the area, and also in the report, there's quite a lot discussion about Russia. And the early years of the transformation of Russia, in the early years, the IMF has been really involved in this transformation process. And you worked, I think, extensively on Russia's transition in the 90s. So from today's perspective, how do you see that experience, the role of the international community, say, not just the IMF, but also United States and other big players in helping Russia to transform? And where you see, I mean, do you see the transformation, I mean, end up successfully, or there's something to do yet?
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. And I want to commend the authors. It's been good to meet Asim today. James I've known since the 90s, and Bikash, who can't be here today, unfortunately, is very smart, wonderful fund economists. Great to support them. So I did have the pleasure or task of working on the transition economies in the early 90s, heavy focused on former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe as well. And I read the paper against that background. So I think in the first instance, what strikes me, and Asim covered a lot of these issues, is just how much more difficult the transition was than one might think today. I mean, we were in uncharted waters. Asim talked about stabilization and the transition output losses. Now, at the time in the US, there were many criminologists who fretted about the shock of the plunge in growth after the Soviet breakup. In fact, the output losses were inevitable. When you think about the Soviet economy, it basically funneled massive resources to the industry to back a military-industrial complex that was no longer needed. And this obviously collapsed along with the misallocation of resources. So the real question we faced at the time, we didn't really have we didn't do a really great job of putting this to the public, was how to achieve macroeconomic stabilization and restore a foundation for subsequent growth. So a related challenge then, of course, was, well, how do you stabilize? And in Russia and the Soviet Union and elsewhere in the transition economies, fiscal and monetary policy had little to do with macroeconomic policy as we know it. It was about fulfilling a plan. And so the finance ministry existed to shovel resources to various facilities. Monetary policy also was about the central bank providing credits to support production. And so, you know, all of a sudden you have this breakup, and how are you going to collect revenues from large firms that are collapsing? How could the central bank, which was still controlled by command economists, be stopped from directing credits to the agricultural sector at harvest time? And so, of course, what you had was that inflation and deficits blew out because we didn't have macroeconomic discipline. So another challenge then was human capital. Even if there were reformers with whom we could engage, there just weren't enough of them to to really understand and promote macroeconomic stabilization. And I remember a few years into the transition, inflation had blown out again in Russia because of directed credits to the agricultural sector. And a mission chief came back from Moscow and he was happy. And so I asked him, why the heck are you happy? And he said that when he landed in Moscow for the very first time, the Russians, interlocutors, had given him tables on monetary, fiscal, and balance of payments according to the fund's definitions. And so he thought this was his greatest achievement. Another challenge was just the interconnection between structural reform and stabilization. So, in a typical fund stress case, to be a little bit simplistic, basically aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, inflation rises, external accounts widen, currency devaluation ensues, the fund comes in and helps them tighten up the macroeconomic situation. But this was not the case in the transition economies. Stabilization and curbing rent-seeking behavior couldn't be achieved without price liberalization. It couldn't be achieved without imposing hard budget constraints on enterprises. But this is very difficult because not only are the vested interests that seem related to, talked about, but closing a state-owned enterprise meant shutting down the social safety net for thousands of people. And price subsidies also meant just eroding the social safety net. And as was further alluded to, you just can't build bankruptcy regimes or the legal infrastructure for a market economy overnight, let alone when you don't have people who know how to do that. So you had massive corruption and whatnot, and it was a worse situation, obviously, in the transition economies in Eastern Europe for the reasons the ambassador mentioned. And then one of the things that always interested me was monetary policy and how do you conduct this. So I'm going to speak more from the Russia standpoint. I think the ambassador spoke about Poland and the Big Bang, and that was a huge success, but it was more complicated the farther east you went. And I'm not even speaking about the issue of the ruble zone and what to do with that. The ethos of the 90s was that exchange rate based stabilization was the only way to arrest high inflation or hyperinflation. And a peg was a transparent vehicle. Basically, everybody in East Europe and the former Soviet Union, they knew who Benjamin Franklin was. He was the guy on the $100 bill, and they had a lot more trust in Benjamin Franklin than they did in, Lenin's picture on the ruble. So, and of course, having a peg at a time of fiscal deficits overburdened monetary policy. And even if the exchange rates at the starting point for the pegs were undervalued, competitiveness eroded over time. So basically what happened was there really weren't exit strategies from pegs, and there were a lot of nasty crashes. And so that was one path, but then the other path was money-based stabilization, but that meant relying on central bank discretion to control credit. Unless you went the Baltic way of currency boards. And relying on central bank discretion was hardly a panacea in this world. So those are just a few of the challenges: unprecedented scale, uncharted waters. Just two observations. First, what do we say about the role of the IMF? I would say positive, very positive, not perfect, but hugely invaluable. Fund staff and the technical assistance, there was a good chart on that, basically offered a crash course in market economics to hundreds of people. The fund was creative in its program support. There was mention of the Systemic Transformation Facility, which we used to call at the time a training wheel standby. There was monthly monitoring in Russia's case, I think even in Ukraine for a while, and bi-monthly monitoring, very intense engagement. James alluded to a topic, Soviet economy or the post-Soviet economy lagged on structural reforms that hurt stabilization, especially in the second half of the 90s. The fund and its shareholders felt a need to keep the fund engaged. I think that was the right strategy. I think the G7's support for the IMF and heavy emphasis, while not perfect, was a positive thing, a very positive thing in the end of the day. But it made for complications for the fund's work, the fund's leverage and reputation to keep the fund out in front. And even though the World Bank and other MDBs really take the lead on structural reforms, in some respects the fund had to be the face of it all, which was a difficult position to be in, but the transition was necessary. So just a last observation then to just wrap it all up is that I was reading the end of the paper, and James' charts alluded to it, but it speaks about common themes across the region. And what were the common themes? Strengthening business environment, balancing fiscal consolidation, improving bank supervision, and addressing skills mismatches. And all I could say when I read that paragraph or that part of the paper, and I compared it with what my experiences were several decades ago working on the transition, is, my gosh, these are like a luxury to have problems of this. These are high-class problems these days in comparison with what we were dealing with in the early years. So maybe that's a backhanded way of saying it is a success story, but obviously there's a lot of work to be done, and I commend the authors.
Thank you, Mark. You mentioned the structural reforms. Azim, a question for you. As we have seen, especially in the recent years, the fund has been re-involved a lot with the region. I'm quite interested to understand and to know from you how you see the role of the IMF in pushing forward structural reforms. I mean, more micro kind of reform. So if you can give some examples of market reforms that the IMF programs helped to develop in these countries, I mean, to improve, say, the business environment, because at the end of the day, I mean, the whole involvement of the IMF is to create sustainable economic growth over the years, and working on structural reform is clearly a key issue. So how you shift your attention from, say, macro imbalances to more micro and structural reforms?
So Andrea, thank you. So I guess in the early days, there was a lot of work being done both on the macro and on the micro side. And I think as Mark just mentioned, even though the IMF's specialty or relative advantage was not on the micro side, we invariably did have to get involved. And since the overall macro programs that we were supporting and the financing that we were providing relied a lot on changes being undertaken at the micro level, in some cases being led by the World Bank, the European Bank, which was created, EBRD, which was created, in fact, at the start of the transition process. We had to, in some sense, develop an expertise in these fields. Privatization was another area where no one really knew, what it meant. How do you take a state organized economy, run entirely by an allocating ministry or agency at the central level, which chose how much individual inputs went to which factories and so on, and suddenly say, no, we're going to have market forces decide the allocation of goods and later on services in this economy. So the transformation then was just massive. The fund was involved in primarily the macro side, helping set up monetary and fiscal institutions and training of officials in those, but then keeping involvement on privatization, on setting up financial sectors and assistance with sort of legal frameworks in the various areas. I think now, 25 years later, as Mark put it, the problems are those that at the time may have been sort of considered as a luxury if only we could have these problems. But the problems are very much still real, and we are getting increasingly involved in those. So for example, on the financial sector side, how to resuscitate bank lending and how to sort of help both banks and individual firms deal with overburdened balance sheets. And so a lot of this has to do with helping on the legal side. Insolvency procedures need to be improved. Out-of-court settlement procedures need to be improved to facilitate sort of workouts of or strengthening of balance sheets so that banks can lend and so that firms are able to borrow more and invest in projects that they have. There's also increased involvement on our side on labor market issues. So we saw in the Western Balkans in particular, but I think in large parts of the region, also in Western Europe, where unemployment is much higher than it was before the crisis, and really is unacceptably high. So what sorts of labor market institutions can help address unemployment issues and help put people back to work? So active labor market policies, other elements of building in labor market flexibility. So these are areas that traditionally we have not had a lot to do with, and we're getting more involved in.
I see. Ambassador Resens, I mean, I come from a country that joined the euro at the very beginning in the late 90s. So I'm a big supporter of the euro. Well, your country just recently joined the euro. It might seem a little bit out of fashion, I mean, to do so. So why you think it was the right choice to get into the euro? How you think it can help, I mean, being a little bit forward-looking, how it can help to lead to a more sustainable growth for your country? Because clearly, if you see the figures, I mean, the recent figures of the last years, I mean, those countries in the European Union but outside the Eurozone were more successful in terms of economic growth. So what was behind your decision to join the euro? I mean, probably not just economic reason, political reason.
Well, it's a very good question, but first let me thank IMF team for an excellent report. I read it with great interest, and it really shows the very dynamics of transition from one economic system to our present day in a very clear way. Although there's one slight thing I just wanted to mention is that in 1940, when my country and many other countries here mentioned the report, when we had this transition from market or capitalism system that existed in 1940 in Europe, what we knew and know from history books, this transition to socialist or communist system took 1 year. So in a way, a return back to normality, to capitalism, was nothing new or nothing really out of ordinary for nations in transition. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it took quite not so long that countries really started to demonstrate very positive trends. It was returned back to Europe. It was returned back to normality. But on euro, it's there are two very strong beliefs in Latvia when we look on our relations in Europe and with Europe. First of all, one of the most important factors that had contributed to good growth and development in Latvia is that we strongly believe in regional integrations. Not only Baltic Sea regional or in between Baltic states or Baltic Nordics, but in general in Europe. And that, I think, is one of the preconditions for well-being and peace and security in Europe, how well integrated we are. So all our reforms, in many ways, have been well supported by this very clear understanding. And the second thing, just look on a map. We are not in the easiest part of Europe. Back in 90s and last 10 years, when we had different dynamics just across our border, it was perhaps less important that it is even today that countries on European periphery really seek to integrate as deep as possible in many European EU structures. And European Union is not a finished project. It's constantly ongoing. What kind of European Union will be facing, let's say, next 10 years is difficult to say. But for my country to joining Eurozone, it's an excellent way how really to be very deep into your European decision-making mechanism is the very same reasoning what Finland had. And third thing, Latvia was among the most successful countries last 20 years, just before crisis struck us in 2008, at the end of 2008. And one of the most important values why our government was so keen to join EU, it simply helped in many ways as reform processes in the 90s helped us really to focus, to consolidate our policies, to front-load very fast reforms and do it fast without waiting. And that's the reason why we got this very fast rebound from the really falling into financial abyss just 3-4 years ago. It's completely different situation. But the next thing, well, the majority of our loans, or loans taken in Latvia a long time before we joined the EU, were in euros. Latvia, our currency was pegged to euro already since 2005, and we still think that the most dynamic regions in Europe, when we look around, it's really the regions where we somehow have developed very good trade relations with, and mostly those are European Eurozone countries. And when you look in this report, there are, well, at the end there is a macroeconomic ranking of the countries. Among 10 top in Europe today, there are 6 Eurozone countries, and 7th is coming, Lithuania. So maybe Eurozone is not doing that bad.
Correct. Thank you very much. Let me turn if there is any question from the floor. Please, if you can present yourself.
Yeah, Tim Bennett, Director General CEO of the Transatlantic Business Council. Ambassador Razins, will the Latvian presidency focus on any particular policy initiative during its presidency that will address some of the economic reform measures and structural reform talked about here? And then for both ambassadors, will potential increases in defense spending among the NATO member countries here have any impact on your ability to pursue economic reform over the next 5 years?
Please.
Well, thank you so much for the question on our EU presidency. Well, it's just a few weeks still to go to the presidency, but definitely Latvia will be paying attention to issues that would facilitate better integration of European single market, and of course issues related to what we discussed today are of great importance. No doubt about that, and you will see the things coming. But of course presidency is kind of a matchmaker between 28 plus European Commission and European Parliament, and at the end you should deliver something. It's not that easy. But on impact on defense expenditure, how much do we spend on defense? Well, we are increasing expenditure, definitely. We had these famous 2% of defense spending before crisis. If we had failed in 2009, 2010, sort out our priorities and fix our problems, financial problems, economic problems, the level of integration, financial integration in the Baltic Sea region, and here I mean among Baltic states and Baltic Nordic, is so deep that if Latvia would have failed, it would automatically will have a spillover effect to our immediate neighborhood, not only within NATO group, but as well EU countries that are not members of NATO. And that would definitely diminish ability of anybody in the region to spend these 2%. But we are increasing. Realities are as they are. That's a big enigma for anybody in Europe. In what way developments in Russia will affect European security? But understanding that perhaps it would be much nicer simply to spend money in other areas but defense. But that's a reality on the ground, and well, the government is doing what the government has to do in these situations.
Well, just a few words. As you may know, Polish people are deeply romantic by character. And we do believe that the freedom is priceless. So whatever money it costs, it's worthwhile. Then we have the economic situation that permits us to get engaged more on the defense and security spendings, but thinking about it not the way that it is necessarily lost money. We try to sign the contracts with the big corporations that will locate the production in Poland, for example. We're using the technological advancement to give a boost to our economy as well. So we don't see it as necessarily just 2% of our growing GDP spendings lost money for something that we appreciate so much.
Thank you. Any other question? Please.
David Bartlett, Kogod School of Business. I would like to invite the panel's comments about Hungary. It's a country I know pretty well, worked there in the 1990s. At that time, Hungary was considered a leader in structural reform, privatization. There was a rigorous macroeconomic stabilization program, the Bolkos program in the mid-1990s. But now we see from the slide presentation that Hungary is actually an outlier relative to the other Central European countries with respect to public debt, fiscal deficit, and so on. So my question is, what happened?
Azim, you want to say something?
Sure, I can say a few things. So Hungary was an early reformer and was one of the original entrance into the European Union in 2004 with the first group of countries from Eastern Europe. So early reforms in Hungary did go well, and it was a recipient of large foreign direct investment, and is very much a sort of a vibrant member of the German supply chain, and so has integrated well with Western Europe. Now, on the other side, as you point out, some imbalances in Hungary are large. For example, public debt in Hungary is among the highest in the region. And until, I guess, the early days of the global crisis, the deficit in Hungary was also among the highest in the region. Though since then, Hungary has made a lot of progress on the deficit side. Debt is still very high, but the deficit is under 3% and I think it has been brought under control. Now, Hungary has been interesting in the sense of reversal of some of the sort of structural reforms that were undertaken early on. So the share of for example, the banking sector that is foreign owned is decreasing, and measures have been taken to impose taxation on many of the foreign investors and so forth. And as a result, the growth performance of Hungary, if you look over a longer spectrum, even in the sort of pre-crisis boom period, was actually very sluggish. So clearly, you know, the structural reforms or the lack of progress in structural reforms seems to be not unrelated to this unimpressive growth performance.
Maybe a final question? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. This is for the panel. Ashish Sen with the Atlantic Council. Could you talk a little bit about the economic implications of what you're seeing happening in Ukraine, and especially with Russia's posturing, also in the context of Western sanctions?
I don't know whether, Mark, you want to say something, or we leave the IMF to answer as you wish. Azim, please.
So, look, as you saw from some of the charts, especially one that James showed of fiscal imbalances, Ukraine, along with many of the countries in the Western Balkans, stands out as sort of having pretty large vulnerabilities on fiscal imbalances, both relatively high debt and, importantly, relatively high deficit. So going into 2014, so at the end of 2013, before sort of the change in government and so forth in Ukraine, imbalances had built up quite a bit. This was, I just spoke about the fiscal, but also the external imbalance was quite large. By our evaluation or our assessment, exchange rate was considerably overvalued at that time. Energy prices were heavily subsidized in an unsustainable way, so it was costing the state large amounts of money. It was related to the fiscal problems. also structural, there were sort of deep-seated structural weaknesses, major issues with business climate and sort of other structural reforms that just had not gotten underway. And again, that was, I think, illustrated in some of the structural charts that James showed towards the end. Ukraine was on the, by his scale, on the left side of so even going into 2014, before sort of the change in government and the upheaval that we've seen in Ukraine in the past year, this was an economy in clear need of major structural change and major changes in addressing macroeconomic imbalances. Now, so I would say that the changes we've seen in the past year have gone in that direction, but there's a lot to do. Now, one other thing that I want to mention is, and this was an observation David Lipton made in a short piece he wrote accompanying sort of the release of this report a few weeks ago, that, you know, there was nothing inherent in this transformation that it would be a peaceful one. It was really such a major change in the way, in the world as we knew it, that started in 1989. Yet, for the most part, the whole transformation was peaceful. Similarly, the transformation in former Yugoslavia, there was nothing inherent that would make it violent, but it was. And I bet that the lack of progress, or much slower progress in former Yugoslavia, is not unrelated to the fact that the lack of a peaceful transformation held things back. So I think that's a lesson for Ukraine going forward. There's nothing inherent that says that in eastern Ukraine there will be violence. But if that is not addressed, then the transformation will be a lot slower and a lot harder.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to finish our conversation this morning. Please join me in thanking our panelists and the IMF for having presented the report, and I hope to see you soon at next EuroGrowth Conversation meeting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.